The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Constable Marcus Thompson adjusted his radio and checked his watch. It was 8:47 a.m. on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday in September. Marcus had been patrolling the outer perimeter of the royal estate for nearly 3 years, and the routine had become second nature to him. Check the barriers, monitor the crowds, ensure the security protocols were followed to the letter. Nothing ever really happened during his shifts, which was exactly how everyone preferred it. Marcus was a man who took pride in his work, perhaps too much pride. At 32 years old, he had spent 8 years with the Thames Valley Police, working his way up from traffic duty to this prestigious assignment. His colleagues often joked that Marcus treated every minor infraction like a potential national security threat. He was the officer who would write parking tickets in empty lots and lecture tourists about standing too close to the royal gates. His dedication was admirable, but his lack of flexibility often rubbed people the wrong way. On this particular morning, Marcus noticed an unusual amount of activity near the main entrance. A ceremonial changing of the guard was scheduled for 11 a.m., which always drew crowds, but there seemed to be more people gathering than usual. Tour groups clustered around the gates, cameras clicking constantly, while street vendors hawked royal memorabilia to eager tourists. Marcus felt his chest swell with importance as he surveyed the scene. This was his domain, and he would ensure everything went according to protocol. The royal guards themselves were already in position, their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats making them instantly recognizable. These men were not just ceremonial figures, despite what many tourists believed. They were highly trained soldiers from elite regiments, responsible for protecting the sovereign and the royal residences. Each guard underwent rigorous selection and training, earning the right to wear the uniform through months of intense preparation. Among the guards that morning was Lance Sergeant James Morrison of the Coldstream Guards. At 28 years old, James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his position at Windsor. He was a quiet, disciplined man who understood the weight of responsibility that came with his role. The bearskin hat he wore had been earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering commitment to duty. Standing motionless for hours at a time was just another challenge he had learned to master. As the morning progressed, Marcus noticed the crowd growing larger and more restless. A group of American tourists had positioned themselves directly in front of the main gate, their guide explaining the history of the guards in loud, animated tones. Children pressed against the barriers, trying to get closer to the motionless figures in red. Parents held up phones and tablets, recording every moment of their royal experience. Marcus felt a familiar twinge of irritation as he watched the scene unfold. The tourists were technically within the allowed area, but they were creating congestion that could become problematic if an emergency arose. He had seen situations like this escalate quickly, with crowd control becoming a serious issue during major events. His training had taught him to identify potential problems before they became actual problems. The police officer began making his way through the crowd, politely but firmly asking people to maintain proper distances from the barriers. Most tourists complied readily, stepping back with apologetic smiles, and continued taking their photos from a more appropriate distance. Marcus felt satisfied with his intervention, convinced he was preventing a potential security issue. However, as he approached the main gate area where Lance Sergeant Morrison stood guard, Marcus noticed something that immediately caught his attention. A small group of teenagers had managed to squeeze closer to the barrier than regulations typically allowed. They were laughing and joking among themselves, occasionally making comments about the motionless guard just a few feet away. One of the teenagers, a boy who could not have been more than 17, suddenly stepped forward and began making faces directly at Lance Sergeant Morrison. The boy pulled exaggerated expressions, waved his hands, and even made rude gestures, trying to provoke some kind of reaction from the stoic guard. His friends giggled and encouraged him, pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he watched the disrespectful display. This was exactly the kind of behavior that undermined the dignity of the royal institution and the brave men who served to protect it. The teenager clearly had no understanding of what the guard represented or the sacrifice and training required to earn that position. In Marcus's mind, this was not just teenage mischief, but a direct assault on British values and traditions. Lance Sergeant Morrison, for his part, remained completely motionless. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists and visitors often tried to provoke reactions from the guards, not understanding that breaking character was not an option. The guard's discipline was absolute. His eyes stared straight ahead, his breathing remained controlled, and not a muscle in his face betrayed any awareness of the teenager's antics. But Marcus was not bound by the same protocols as the Royal Guard. As a police officer, he felt it was his duty to intervene and restore order. He approached the group of teenagers with determined steps, his hand resting on his radio in case backup was needed. The crowd around them had begun to notice the commotion, with more phones being raised to capture whatever was about to unfold. The confrontation that was about to occur would have consequences that none of the participants could have anticipated. What started as teenage mischief and overzealous policing was about to escalate into an incident that would make international headlines and forever change the lives of everyone involved. The stage was set for a clash between different interpretations of duty, respect, and authority that would test the very foundations of British institutional tradition. As Marcus reached the group of teenagers, the boy who had been taunting the guard turned his attention to the approaching police officer with the same mischievous grin that had been directed at Lance Sergeant Morrison. The teenager seemed to view the entire scene as an elaborate game, unaware that he was about to become the catalyst for an incident that would reshape how royal security protocols were understood and implemented. The morning that had started so routinely for both Marcus Thompson and James Morrison was about to become the most significant day of their respective careers, though neither man could have imagined the chain of events that was about to unfold in the shadow of Windsor Castle's ancient walls. Marcus Thompson's voice cut through the morning air as he addressed the group of teenagers with the authoritative tone he had perfected over years of police work. The 17-year-old who had been making faces at Lance Sergeant Morrison turned toward the approaching officer, his expression shifting from mischievous to defiant. What should have been a simple request to show respect was about to spiral into something far more complex. The teenager, whose name was Tyler Jenkins according to the passport he carried in his backpack, was visiting London with his family from Ohio. This was his first trip to Europe, and everything about the experience felt surreal and exciting. The guards in their elaborate uniforms seemed like characters from a movie rather than real soldiers. Tyler had spent the morning treating the entire scene as an elaborate tourist attraction, completely unaware of the serious military tradition he was witnessing. When Marcus firmly instructed the teenagers to step back and show proper respect to the guard, Tyler's American sensibilities kicked in. He had grown up in a culture where questioning authority was considered healthy, where police officers were viewed as public servants rather than figures of absolute authority. The idea that he could not freely express himself in a public space seemed foreign and restrictive to his young mind. Instead of complying with Marcus's request, Tyler crossed his arms and challenged the police officer's authority. He pointed out that he was not breaking any laws, that he was standing in a public area, and that he had every right to be there as a tourist who was contributing to the British economy. His friends, emboldened by Tyler's defiance, began recording the interaction more openly, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin as the teenager continued to argue. In his experience, when people challenged police authority, it usually escalated into more serious problems. He had dealt with countless situations where initial defiance led to actual lawbreaking, and his training taught him to establish control quickly and decisively. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger, and Marcus was acutely aware that his handling of this situation was being scrutinized by dozens of witnesses. The police officer's frustration was compounded by his genuine respect for the royal guards and what they represented. Marcus had always admired the discipline and dedication of these elite soldiers. He understood that they could not defend themselves from harassment while maintaining their ceremonial duties, which made him feel personally responsible for protecting their dignity. In his mind, allowing this disrespectful behavior to continue would be a failure of his duty as both a police officer and a British citizen. Meanwhile, Lance Sergeant Morrison continued to stand motionless, but internally, he was processing everything that was happening around him. His training included extensive preparation for dealing with difficult situations while maintaining ceremonial protocol. Guards were taught to ignore provocation, to remain focused on their duties regardless of external distractions. However, Morrison was also acutely aware that the situation was escalating in ways that could potentially affect overall security. The conversation between Marcus and Tyler grew more heated with each exchange. Tyler insisted that he was not doing anything wrong and that the police officer was overstepping his authority. Marcus maintained that showing respect to the royal guards was not just expected but required, and that Tyler's behavior was unacceptable regardless of his nationality or tourist status. The cultural clash was becoming more pronounced as neither side seemed willing to back down. Other tourists began choosing sides in the confrontation. Some agreed with Marcus that the teenager should show proper respect for British traditions and institutions. Others supported Tyler's right to express himself freely, viewing the police officer's intervention as heavy-handed and unnecessary. The crowd dynamics were shifting from curious observation to active engagement, with people pulling out phones and beginning to voice their own opinions about who was right and who was wrong. As the argument continued, Marcus made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. In an attempt to physically redirect Tyler away from the guard area, he reached out and placed his hand on the teenager's shoulder. Tyler immediately shrugged off the contact and stepped backward, bumping directly into Lance Sergeant Morrison. The collision was entirely accidental, but its consequences were immediate and severe. Tyler's backward movement caused him to knock into the perfectly positioned guard, disrupting Morrison's stance and causing the tall bearskin hat to shift slightly on his head. For a ceremonial guard whose training emphasized absolute motionlessness and perfect presentation, this disruption represented a serious breach of protocol. In that instant, several things happened simultaneously. Tyler spun around to apologize to the guard he had accidentally bumped. Marcus lunged forward to prevent any further contact between the civilian and the royal guard. And Lance Sergeant Morrison, responding to what his training had taught him to interpret as a potential security threat, began to turn his head to assess the situation. The movement was slight, barely perceptible to most observers, but Marcus noticed it immediately. In his heightened state of frustration and his determination to maintain proper protocol, he interpreted Morrison's subtle head movement as the guard-breaking character due to Tyler's disruption. This perceived failure of the guard's discipline seemed to confirm Marcus's belief that the teenager's behavior was causing serious problems that required immediate correction. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but those seconds would be replayed and analyzed countless times in the days that followed. Marcus, acting on impulse and frustration rather than training or protocol, reached out toward Lance Sergeant Morrison. His intention was unclear even to himself, perhaps to straighten the guard's hat, perhaps to somehow restore the proper ceremonial positioning that had been disrupted by Tyler's accidental contact. But Lance Sergeant Morrison, trained to respond to unexpected physical contact as a potential security threat, instinctively shifted his position to protect himself and maintain his duty station. This movement brought him directly into the path of Marcus's outstretched hand. creating a moment of contact between the police officer and the royal guard that neither man had intended. In Marcus's mind, this contact represented the guard actively resisting his attempt to restore proper order. His frustration with Tyler, his concern about the growing crowd, and his determination to maintain the dignity of the royal institution all combined into a moment of poor judgment that would define the rest of his career. Without thinking clearly about the consequences, Marcus pulled back his arm and delivered what he intended as a corrective gesture, but what appeared to everyone watching as a deliberate punch directed at one of Her Majesty's guards. The sound of the impact, though not particularly loud, seemed to echo across the courtyard as dozens of witnesses realized what they had just observed. Cameras that had been casually recording the tourist interaction suddenly became focused on capturing what was clearly going to be a major incident. Lance Sergeant Morrison, despite years of training in maintaining composure under pressure, could not help but react to the unexpected assault. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some gasped in shock at seeing a police officer strike a royal guard. Others began shouting about the inappropriateness of the action. Tyler stood frozen, realizing that his simple act of teenage rebellion had somehow contributed to a situation that was now completely beyond his control or understanding. Marcus Thompson looked around at the sea of shocked faces and recording devices, and in that moment, he understood that his life was about to change forever. What had started as a routine morning patrol and a simple crowd control issue had escalated into an international incident that would be impossible to explain or excuse. The silence that followed Marcus Thompson's punch lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal to everyone present in the courtyard of Windsor Castle. Lance Sergeant Morrison stood perfectly still, his training preventing him from retaliating despite the shock and pain radiating from where the police officer's fist had connected with his jaw. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but there was no mistaking the slight tremor that ran through his rigid posture. Within moments, the quiet was shattered by the sound of whistles and running footsteps as other royal guards and security personnel rushed to the scene. The incident had been witnessed by multiple cameras, both from tourists and from the extensive security system that monitored every inch of the royal estate. There would be no disputing what had happened, no room for alternative interpretations of the events that had just unfolded. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Looking around at the shocked faces of tourists, the approaching security personnel, and the unwavering figure of Lance Sergeant Morrison, he understood that his career in law enforcement was effectively over. More than that, he had committed an act that could be interpreted as an assault on the crown itself, given the symbolic role that royal guards play in protecting the monarchy. Tyler Jenkins, the American teenager whose defiance had started the chain of events, stood paralyzed with disbelief. His friends had stopped recording, sensing that they had witnessed something far more serious than a simple tourist confrontation. Tyler's parents, who had been shopping for souvenirs nearby, came running when they heard the commotion, arriving just in time to see their son standing near a police officer who was being surrounded by angry security personnel. The first to reach the scene was Sergeant Major William Hayes of the Coldstream Guards, a veteran soldier with 25 years of experience who had witnessed many unusual incidents during his service, but nothing quite like this. Hayes immediately assessed the situation, noting Morrison's maintained position and professional composure despite the obvious assault he had endured. The sergeant major's priority was to ensure the security of the area while preserving the dignity of the guard unit. Hayes approached Marcus with controlled fury evident in every step. The idea that a police officer, someone who was supposed to be working in cooperation with royal security, had physically assaulted one of his men was almost incomprehensible. The sergeant major's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question when he ordered Marcus to step away from the guard and explain his actions immediately. Marcus attempted to explain what had happened. But his words came out in a confused rush that only made the situation worse. He talked about the disrespectful teenager, the need to maintain proper protocol, and his intention to simply restore order to the situation. But as he spoke, Marcus realized how weak and inadequate his justification sounded. There was no reasonable explanation for why a trained police officer would strike a member of the Royal Guard who was performing ceremonial duties. The crowd of tourists had grown significantly as word of the incident spread throughout the area. People who had been visiting other parts of the castle grounds came running to see what was happening, creating a security concern that required immediate attention. Additional police officers arrived on the scene, but their position was complicated by the fact that one of their own colleagues was clearly the aggressor in the situation. Inspector Sarah Mitchell of the Thames Valley Police was among the first senior officers to arrive. She had worked with Marcus for several years and knew him to be dedicated but sometimes overly rigid in his interpretation of rules and protocols. However, nothing in his record had suggested he was capable of the kind of behavior that multiple witnesses were now describing. Inspector Mitchell found herself in the impossible position of having to arrest a fellow officer for assaulting a royal guard. Meanwhile, Lance Sergeant Morrison continued to maintain his post despite the chaos surrounding him. His training had prepared him to remain focused on his duties regardless of external circumstances, and he demonstrated that training perfectly in the moments following the assault. However, Sergeant Major Hayes recognized that Morrison needed to be relieved of duty and given proper medical attention to assess any injury from the punch. The replacement of Morrison with another guard was accomplished with military precision, but the symbolism of the moment was not lost on anyone present. The idea that a royal guard had to be removed from his post due to an assault by a police officer was unprecedented in modern history. This incident would require investigation at the highest levels of both the police force and the military hierarchy. As Inspector Mitchell placed Marcus under arrest, reading him his rights in front of dozens of recording tourists, the full weight of his actions began to settle on the disgraced police officer. He would face criminal charges for assault, disciplinary action from his department, and the public humiliation of having his moment of poor judgment broadcast around the world through social media and news outlets. Tyler Jenkins and his family were also taken into custody, not because they had committed any crime, but because their testimony would be crucial to understanding exactly what had precipitated the incident. Tyler was finally beginning to understand that his casual disrespect had contributed to a situation with serious consequences for everyone involved. The teenager who had viewed the guards as tourist attractions was learning a hard lesson about the reality behind the ceremonial uniforms. The investigation that followed would reveal the complexity of what had occurred. Security footage showed Tyler's initial harassment of the guard, Marcus's intervention, the accidental collision, and the fateful punch that ended Marcus's career. Expert analysis would demonstrate that Lance Sergeant Morrison had done nothing wrong throughout the entire incident, maintaining his professionalism even while being assaulted. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Marcus Thompson was charged with assault and faced additional disciplinary action from the Thames Valley Police. His defense attorney attempted to argue that the stress of the situation and his genuine desire to protect the dignity of the Royal Guard had led to a momentary lapse in judgment. But the evidence was too clear and the incident too serious for such explanations to carry much weight. Lance Sergeant Morrison recovered from his injury and returned to duty within a week, but the incident had a lasting impact on royal security protocols. New guidelines were established for interaction between local police and royal guards, and additional training was implemented to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. Morrison himself handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism he had shown during the incident, declining media interviews and focusing on his continued service to the Crown. Marcus Thompson ultimately pleaded guilty to assault charges and received a suspended sentence along with community service requirements. he was dismissed from the police force and struggled to find employment that would accept someone with his criminal record. The man who had taken such pride in his service to law and order found himself branded as someone who had betrayed both institutions he had sworn to protect. Tyler Jenkins returned to Ohio with a story that would follow him for years. The video footage of the incident became viral content, teaching him about the power of social media and the lasting consequences of actions that might seem innocent at the time. He later wrote about the experience for his school newspaper, emphasizing the importance of understanding cultural differences and showing respect when visiting other countries. The incident became a case study in police academies and military training programs, demonstrating how quickly routine situations can escalate when communication breaks down and emotions override professional judgment. The lasting lesson was that respect, restraint, and proper understanding of roles and responsibilities are essential when different institutions and authorities interact in public spaces. For Windsor Castle, the incident led to enhanced security measures and clearer protocols for handling tourist interactions with ceremonial guards. The dignity and tradition of the Royal Guard system remained intact, but the awareness of potential complications had been permanently heightened by one police officer's moment of catastrophic, poor judgment.